and we hand over to Steve Blank, who I think you all know, and Cristobal, who will have a fireside chat with him.
So my first question, so when you developed the framework to rethink how startups are built, basically the 4 steps to epiphany, you were not planning to change how corporate innovation was performed. So what factors lead to the increasing adoption of the lean startup in corporate context, especially if large companies are not bigger versions of startups?
Well, that's a great question, and the short answer, I'll certainly give you the longer one, is a single word, which is desperation. Um, and what I mean by that is, for all of you in corporations, I don't have to tell you what's changed in the 21st century, but some are obvious and some are not. Obviously, competition has gone global in the 21st century. China is both a huge customer and as a source of manufacturing and as a source of competitive leverage for companies that have adopted manufacturing there. But the second part, and actually there's probably about 4 parts. The second part is the one that might not be obvious if you didn't live in the 20th century in a corporation, is that when I was an entrepreneur in the 20th century, startups were viewed as ankle biters. That is, somebody who barely came up to the ankles of corporations. I mean, no one would have ever considered that a startup was a threat to a large company. Well, now startups are raising more money than large companies have for available R&D dollars and more. That was just unimaginable and unbelievable. Number 3 is, of course, the rapid shift of technology. Seems like every 18 months there's another technology wave that's disrupting your business or accelerating your business or accelerating some other change that you have to grapple with. And the most obvious one has been that the internet has changed customer loyalty. And we built brands that lasted 50 years longer in the 20th century. Now a startup could build brands in 18 months or shorter. And all the things that we thought were our capital are no longer that important. And that has some other consequences, is that, the internet also allowed, if not perfect information, just enormous amount of information to be available to the consumers in a way that they never had access to. So all these things have added up to the phrase we tend to use called disruption. But it just simply means that if you've gone to business school later than 5 years ago, everything you know is obsolete other than accounting. I'm just saying that facetiously to make the point that it's not that we've gotten dumber. It's just that the world has changed more rapidly around us. And of course, the last part, and this one I'm guilty of, is that startups for the first time in their history have methodologies and tools that they never had access to before. And those tools were obviously, the whole lean startup methodology, my work, Eric Ries's work, and Osterwalder's work are kind of the sum of what became an explosion of hundreds of thousands of other people building tool sets that look very seductive to large corporations, going, hey, look what startups are doing. There's these incubators and they can run lean, and why don't we do that as well? And gee, they have posters and coffee cups and dogs at work, and why don't we do that? They're and Cristobal, I'll pause on the point that we essentially created a cargo cult in large corporations, and I'll explain what that means to if the viewers don't know what that is, but that's essentially what's happened, and that creates the phrase innovation theater.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question at all, or did I over answer?
Yeah, you did. So, and on that thing, so basically on that innovation theater, basically the application of lean startup is neither easy nor straightforward in large companies. So in your view, what is needed to make it work, both on the company side and on the toolset side?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's needed to make it work is stop thinking about the tools and start thinking about the outcome. I think that was the mistake that got made, is that, Obviously, I love the tools. I help build them, but in a large corporation, that's not why you're using the tools. You're using the tools to deploy, to build and deploy things with speed and urgency. Um, okay, so how does that work in a large company? Well, it's worth stepping back, and since most of you are in a large, or all of you are in large companies, you know this better than I. But number one is, while a startup is not a smaller version of a large company is not a bigger version of a startup. And what I mean by that is, let's go through some of the obvious and maybe not some of the unobvious. You know, in a startup, you could do anything. And what I mean by anything is, you could now in the 21st century get funded to break the law. And companies do all the time. What do I mean by that? Uber breaks the law. Airbnb broke the law. In the United States, Tesla broke the law for distribution, and in fact got funded for hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, because investors have finally realized that in some of these markets there are rent seekers. Some of them might be your companies that have locks on businesses, but VCs realized, investors have realized, those markets are so large, we're happy to do them. I make the point because if you tried the same thing in your company, your general counsel would be in your CEO's office in about 30 seconds and say, which one of us looks great in prison stripes? So number one is, you can't have the same moves as startups, even in addressing available markets. Number two is, and I'll just go through a list and you can make your own longer list, is that 99% of your company has come to work to execute a known business model. That is, your companies have gotten large because you've at some point in its growth have figured out what repeatability and scale means. You know, we add more people, we get more. If we add, you know, N dollars, we get N plus plus X dollars out of output. And so we built process and procedure and OKRs and KPIs, and we've built an execution machine. It doesn't mean your companies aren't innovating, but most of the people and process you have in place is for execution. Well, that has all kind of unintended consequence, because you're competing with startups that have 100% of their people focused on innovation and execution, at least until they get to a certain size. And all of a sudden, you know, now when you try to innovate, you're running into, unless you have built a parallel process, and we could get into some of these solutions later, is that everything you're doing threatens the execution machine, or if it doesn't threaten it, it strangles innovation in its crib, and not sometimes on purpose, but mostly by accident, because you built these OKRs and processes and whatever for execution. And everything we run into, every complaint we hear about running innovation inside of a large corporation, is simply because we don't understand that we haven't built processes for innovation. We've built activities for innovation. Big idea. If there's any idea you take out of this, incubators and accelerators and all that great stuff we have, that's a point activity. That's not an innovation process. That's why it ends up as theater. It's not wrong. It's just usually not connected to anything. You know, it's kind of like building a piece of plumbing and expecting water to come out when you haven't connected it on either end. Did I answer a question? And we could go on through the list of what's different. I'll give you another difference. You know, employees at startups versus large companies aren't smarter. They're just motivated different. You know, in a startup, you come to work, at least the first 100 people, maybe more if you're great at building startup culture, to change the world. Most of your people are coming to work to get a paycheck, and there's nothing wrong. That's not a pejorative. That's, you know, they have a business card, they have a job spec, they do a good job, and then they go home. You're competing against people who think they're on a mission from God, and so culture is different. And we could go through that list, and unless you understand those distinctions of what's different here in people and process and financing, you know, one of your expertise, Cristobal, is building these kind of collaborations for incubation and startups. In fact, your white paper is brilliant. But if you think about it, that's kind of sometimes rate limited by the amount of money your CFO will give you internally for new ventures. Because if you're a CFO, you're calculating ROI for internal things, and therefore your funnel is limited. outside, your VC's fund is almost unlimited. That is, capital and valuations are just unbelievable compared to what you're arguing for inside in your own innovation pipeline. And that is, if you would take those ideas outside your building and monetize them, you could sometimes get 10 to 100x more than you can from your internal resources. So all those things are different. And what was your question? I completely forgot. Sorry, guys. I hope this answered some of it.
Is answering some bits of it. So it looks like we need, or corporates need, an innovation doctrine. And we, yes, last time we talk about the innovation doctrine that is also connected to these new processes in HR, in finance. So tell us a little bit about what this innovation doctrine can look like in practice.
Yeah,
and
well,
how
this goes by doctrine. I really mean kind of an end-to-end process. You know, I'm not the first one to think about this. Is back in the 20th century, Tushman and O'Reilly came up with this notion of an ambidextrous organization, which is a fancy word for companies that could chew gum and walk at the same time, meaning can do execution and innovation, competently at both without strangling each other or shooting your core business in the head or something else. An innovation doctrine just simply says, well, organizationally, what's the organizational design on the top level for how does rapid innovation happen while we're executing our core business? And, we could either be thinking about it as how do we do Horizon 1, 2, and 3 innovation as we're kind of doing product stuff in the McKinsey speak, or just basically recognizing that innovation processes and execution processes are simply not the same. And if we don't have different HR policies and different, legal policies and different, engineering delivery policies, if they're all running at the same clock speed with the same whatever, we're going to have point activities like our incubators and accelerators. And again, I'm not knocking them. I just think they're symptomatic of trying to copy a piece of what startup culture and tools look like without understanding we've basically built airplanes made out of straw, because when we saw real airplanes with goods that came off of them, we realized, well, that was a good thing. And this phrase cargo cult is what happened in the Pacific Ocean. And after World War II, when Americans came to these islands and had cargo planes disgorging tons of goods and materials that the natives have ever seen. After the war ended, the planes and the Americans left. And so the natives built airplanes out of straw or, palm leaves, thinking that if they did that the goods would come out. That's what we've done in corporations and building these accelerators, thinking if we just copy that airplane, magic will happen. And I want to be very specific. I don't know if it happens in any of your companies, but I've been around to see, okay, we built the accelerator. Well, my first question is, great, draw for me the diagram on how this gets delivered through your existing channel or through your engineering organization or through product management. And people kind of change the subject and say, hey, have you seen our newest coffee mug? Or look at the great poster we have in the cafeteria. And the reason why is, well, figuring out all the other stuff requires a food fight in the exec staff. What happens when we have channel conflict? Or, gee, who sets the priority for engineering? All of a sudden, if this incubator is coming out with great MVPs, but this wasn't budgeted or scheduled, who's setting those priorities? Or wait a minute, this is a great idea, but legal is really nervous. Or, gee, do we kill these things? Or do we have a process to spin some of them out? Or do we have a process to maybe, do something else? And by the way, the other piece, which I'm sure you all understand, is in a large corporation, failure is not an option. If you've had an existing business model and you have process and procedure, if someone screws up an existing process, they're the idiot. And I mean that just to make the point. It was an existing process. It's why you hire and fire people, is that, guys, this is a level of competency. But to apply those same rules and that same culture to innovation, when we all know innovation is a funnel, not a pipeline, things will fail. If you haven't established that this group over here, if they're not failing, we're not doing innovation hard enough. Well, how do you keep those cultures separate and yet still maintain cohesion across the company? And the line I like to use is, well, execution pays your salary, but innovation pays your pension. But if both parts of the company are not aligned, that each one of them are necessary, you also get this cultural food fight. And so part of an innovation doctrine, Cristobal, to answer your question, is how do we integrate all these ideas that are understood from the board or your managing directors to your exec staff, acknowledging, yes, VP of sales, you're responsible for execution of current channel, but we will be creating stuff that at times will create channel conflict, and we'll figure out how to personally compensate you to allow it. But that is part of the growth of the company. And also having the company at its highest level understand that innovation almost always happens at the edges. Hopefully the edges are inside your company and then eventually grow into the center. That's the classic of why you do Horizon 3 activities in a company, or why you're acquiring startups, because you couldn't get that culture inside. And by the way, in some companies, it might make sense just to acquire it, because you don't either have the time, the patience, or to create a funnel. Well, okay, if you have enough capital, you could acquire innovation. Did any of that answer your question, Cristobal? And this should be an end-to-end strategy, not we have an incubator. And I think a lot of smart companies are coming to that conclusion, is we need all the moving parts. It's not just one piece. And if all we've done is copy the lean startup method, well, that's great for shaping culture. I mean, I don't want to say it's bad, but by itself, it's completely insufficient inside of a large corporation, which for those of you who are consultants, this is new work for the next 20 years for you. But and I mean that in a nice way, because there is a lot of work in connecting these moving parts. How do we get ambidexterity in corporations? Those require your existing execution people to actually back up and leadership to say, oh, look, we need to be running an additional set of processes. Now, remember, in the 20th century, this was optional. It's a big idea. Well, why should we have to change organizations? Why go back to the first thing I said? In the 20th century, at best, you were competing with your peers, and you were competing on a time cycle, maybe measured in years, if not decades. Well, that's the part that's changed. Why do we need to do this now? Again, we haven't gotten stupider, but the world around us is moving at a faster pace, with entrants with capital that we've never had, with global players we've never seen, with technology kind of obsoleting all pieces of our business. And so therefore, we need to think about, how does leadership view this? What type of organizational design do we need? What type of new processes and procedures? How do we deliver stuff at speed that we could test parts of our business without destroying the core? The best company that's pulled that off is, at least the ones I think about, at least in tech, which is my world, is Netflix has pulled that off. Apple's pulled that off. Microsoft reinvented themselves without, they shot Windows in the head, though Windows is still a key part of their business, but they've, moved to the cloud after almost becoming completely obsolete. And there are some models of how companies have done that well. My favorite is W.L. Gore in a not tech business. These folks made, a $10 billion business out of taking Teflon and stretching it. That is, PTFE. That's all they make. But they have medical device businesses. They have, clothing lines. They make Gore-Tex. They make all kinds of other stuff. And so there are some companies that have built that into basically into designing the organization itself. Sorry about the soliloquy, Cristobal, but I've been thinking about this hard. And interestingly enough, I feel guilty about it, because the permission to use lean started when the Harvard Business Review in May 2013 put on its cover why the lean startup changes everything. I called that the day the hell froze over cover. So whoever thought, HBR would be saying we need to look over here. Well, even I didn't understand at the time that was not a magic wand. In fact, it ended up to be kind of more of a curse than a blessing, because it stopped people from thinking about the hard things you need to do. It seemed to be the easy thing. Well, let's kind of have these magic tools come in, and then we'll be able to be as agile as startups. And it doesn't work that way, as you all know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. And actually, in your thinking, and also Tushman and O'Reilly, they say, okay, for ambidexterity to really flourish, you need integration at the top, at the senior leadership, right? So I think
Absolutely.
that's kind of a key problem, that we need to really shape the leaders of the new future. And it seems that it's sort of a combination between the Alfred Sloans and the Billy Durants. So managerial execution and entrepreneurial search. Is that the leaders that we need to really integrate the corporates to really run this end to end?
Yes, but I want to remind you, I'm assuming I'm speaking to a lot of people in Europe, so I'm going to be using an American set of problems, and maybe it's different in Europe, but in the U.S., remember, CEOs report to a board of directors, and the board of directors is worrying about activist investors. If you're a large company in the U.S., and that's just people who want to take apart your company and sell it for piece parts because the stock price isn't high enough. Take a look at GE and Procter and Gamble, et cetera. So now all of a sudden, you want to think about innovation and building a company for the next 30 years, and your board and activists are, telling you that your profits from executing your core business are not good enough. And so now you have multiple things distracting you, which is why, companies run by their founders who own a majority control have a lot more freedom that sometimes CEOs of regularly structured public companies. Sometimes the structure distracts you and focuses you on short-term goals. Remember, setting up an innovation engine costs you some money, time, and energy. And sometimes, by the way, much like at GE, the CEO goes in the other direction and basically chases the shiny object so much that they lose sight of, core bottom line of their divisions. I mean, that's what happened at GE when they kind of stopped paying attention to the component piece parts and started trying to make profits out of spreadsheets. So this is a tough thing for CEOs of large companies and their board. So yes, the other thing I've seen happen, and Osterwalder and I talk about this all the time, the people who love all these innovation tools and processes are the middle managers who want to run accelerators and incubators. They're not the leaders. And at worst, maybe the CEO is actually using the words innovation in once a paragraph because he knows or she knows that's what's supposed to be said. But no one has actually come in and said, well, how do we connect these activities, with a strategy? That is, to me, it's how do we deliver things with speed and urgency that help us either grow our business or existing business or create new ones. What's that strategy? The other thing is, and this one, it just took me a couple of years to figure out, and smiling if some of you know these people. It turns out the innovators inside of large companies, most of them want to be heroes. When I go, no, your job is to convince the senior leadership about organizational design and whatever, they go, oh, no, it's much more fun to be heroes. And what I mean by that is that if you think about it, almost every large company has stories about the individual who fought the system and came up with a new idea and was able to get something delivered and whatever. And we even reward people for that, right? Some of them have innovation awards. I have yet to find a company who says, wait a minute, do you realize we're actually rewarding stupidity? That is, we don't have repeatable processes to do this. We're actually rewarding people who fought a broken system. Maybe we should actually build a system so people didn't have to fight to be heroes, that it would automatically just happen. Well, when I suggest that to all people, the heroes, they go, no, we love being heroes. We don't want a system that would make this automatic. So I find it kind of broken on both sides without, and it's not like the heroes would go away. It was like they like being heroes, but they don't want to make the system work. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
Have any of you encountered that, the hero culture in your organization? Right. And tell them they're no longer going to be heroes, that it's going to be just a process that you could just plug into. And they'll like, oh, no, my world is, I love solving, political problems. Because by the way, when you do customer discovery well in a large company, half your discovery has to be internal right now. You got to figure out like who's the saboteur. You got to figure out You know, what does legal think? You got to figure out where's the existing engineering resources. You got, instead of all this just kind of being a natural part of, well, oh, let's put that in the innovation pipeline. There is no end-to-end process. Does any of this
Yeah.
make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, Steve. Thanks. So, as you may know, the Lean Startup has been recently criticized in the academic literature for its incremental orientation. Basically, the close yet narrow focus on immediate customer validation. It was said to look for your keys under the streetlight. So given the wicked problems and grand challenges that we face today, you know, pandemic, climate change, economic recovery, how can we extend the tool set to address such radical, distant, and uncertain moonshots where validation with multiple stakeholders and ecosystem is needed? Or is that too much to ask for a tool set? What's your thoughts on that?
So first of all, Cristobal, you know, I guess you've made the big time when your ideas are actually being criticized in academic literature rather than on, you know, Hacker News. And so I'm actually honored that it is. And I hear this a lot, and it really is. And you know, I don't mean to get into he said, she said, but it really is the difference between Eric Ries's point of view and what he has kind of proselytized. And by the way, Lean would have never caught fire without Eric's kind of evangelism. And what I actually believe, and I wrote about it in the original book called The 4 Steps to Epiphany. And let me explain. You know, when you look at Lean as described in its simplest form, it's like, let's get out of the building and ask people what they want. Well, that's great for an existing market. In an existing market, it's actually an incredibly effective tool set. You know, you could ask customers, like, they'll tell you the basis of competition. You might think it's X, but they'll tell you it's Y. You know, you could like ask them, will they buy it? And they'll say, yeah. And you could say, give me 20% down now. And they'll go, okay, or yes or no. And you could get validation immediately. But things get interesting. And this is the criticism, if you don't understand the distinction between Eric's view and mine, is that works in existing markets, but it doesn't work in new markets. In new markets, you can't ask people, would you like it blue or green? They don't even know what the hell you're talking about. And so how can I get out of the building and ask, you know, this is the classic, you know, like if Henry Ford would have asked people what they want, it would have been a horse with 6 legs, or Steve Jobs said, I never talked to customers. Well, that's wrong. They actually did. They just didn't understand they were doing it unconsciously, but we can build a conscious process. The conscious process is first thing is to understand, are you in a new market, resegmenting an existing market, or an existing market? Or we could use whatever taxonomy you want. Are you creating a blue ocean strategy or something else? But the questions and type of discovery change. And I'll just give you a short example to differentiate the two. In a new market, one that doesn't exist, but you're creating, of course you want to get out of the building. But what you want to understand is, what's the day in the life of a customer today? And what do you envision it's going to be when you like create this new thing? If you don't understand what it's like today, then you're just guessing about what it's going to be like tomorrow. And more importantly, what ancillary things or underpinning technologies have to happen? Does this require rollout of 5G? Does this require change in regulation? Does this require X or Y to happen? Well, how do you know that? Have you talked to those partners or regulators? Do you understand that technology? And so discovery takes on different forms, but it is truly customer discovery. And so I think the thing that people miss is that, you know, when you've got to make sure you're reviewing whose version of Lean. Mine says is there isn't one type of new venture. There's a series of, and again, we could use the McKinsey model. Is it Horizon 1, 2, and 3? Discovery is very different for each one of them. And to use the methodology at its core is the same, but the details are what matters. You can't ask people, so if it was cheaper, would you buy it? I don't even know what the hell you're talking about in a new market, right? But that's an incredibly valid question in an existing market. Does that help Cristobal at all?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think the model at its core is valid for all types. It's, you know, when you're in academia, you kind of get tripped up on the footnotes and forget to look at the big picture. But I am honored, honestly. I'm amused for what was by the way, just for all of you, you've heard it here. what's now lean was just me trying to describe my experience of 20 years as an entrepreneur. Because when I was an entrepreneur doing startups, basically investors said, do everything large companies do. Seriously, large companies hire sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one. You do that. Large companies write 5-year forecasts on day one. You do that too. Large companies, spec the entire product and then hire engineering, and back then it took years to develop the product. Well, you do that. That isn't, we want you to predict the future. So just go build the product, and when you ship it, the only problem you're going to have is whether your building is big enough to hold all the bags of money that will come. And of course, none of that happened. And so my experience said this ain't right. And so I was trying to solve a problem for myself to kind of describe, well, if this isn't right, what is right? And that's what customer development, and then Eric's observation about agile engineering and Osterwalder's canvas came together to solve. But its complexity was kind of hidden if I really understood that using the tools exactly as is in those different markets didn't work. So you needed to have a more sophisticated view about the types of innovation you were going after. That's my answer. And the other answer could be, maybe they're right, that this is the world's stupidest tool set. But you and I have known each other for a while. I keep giggling going, I can't believe this is a 20-year-old process we're still talking about, and that somebody's going to come up with something that's have much better insight. I think that opportunity does exist in large corporations. Lean is a activity, but it's an incomplete theory of innovation in large corporations. And as I said, we've seen signs of what needs to be done, starting with ambidextrous organization. I suggest you all go back and read that 20th century literature. They were onto something. It just wasn't desperately needed at the time. Now it's desperately needed, and we have much better tool sets to kind of integrate it with, but we still don't have a theory of the whole. Does that put that in context?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think in that academic or literature, they also, point that the relevance of the experimentation that you brought, that all the lean approach brought the experimentation into the corporates. And in this seminar, we were discussing about, what are the new roles that we will need in the corporation, like the chief experimentation officer, related to this innovation doctrine that can really run this experiment. And I believe that by this iterative experimentation, you can also address this wicked challenge. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and though I want to make sure, because I ran into this trap, and when Osterwalder and I started brainstorming on this, the first thing we came up with was, you need some new titles. I don't think so. So let me push back. You will get new titles, but actually the first thing you need is a new organizational design. And by that, I mean, draw me the diagram of how stuff gets out of your building, faster with speed and urgency, that allows you to experiment with stuff and pivot. Pivot is probably one of the most radical parts of lean, both along with MVPs, minimum viable products. An MVP allows you to kind of put something in front of a customer that you would have been aghast to do in the 20th century, buggy, unfinished, whatever. But a pivot allows you to change your mind without getting fired. It's a big idea. A pivot says, hey, we ran this experiment. We thought the customers were over here. They're actually over here. Or we thought the product features should be all these. It turns out they only care about feature 4, 7, and 12. Okay, let's rapidly shift. Well, you can't do that in your existing product line. You already got a product line, and people want more features or different color, or you want to optimize the supply chain and make it cheaper or something else. So you need a process that actually does that. So the first thing I would be doing is, what problem do we want to solve? And what would an organization look like that works inside of our company, not an activity? An activity, again, not to beat it up, is an incubator. A process is, how do I get ideas in on one end, or technology in on one end, and rapid delivery of new ideas or new tests or new something else at the other end? Oh, that eventually become mainstream inside my company. And without screwing up the core. So I keep reminding everybody, in a startup, there's no core to screw up. In a large corporation, you don't want to screw up the core. So one is do no damage, but two is, which is why this is tough, but do a lot of stuff at speed. Oh, well, if I try to pile that all into my existing stage gate process or whatever else I'm using internally, you're going to just create havoc. So how do I run these things and chew gum and walk? And there are different types of organizational design you could come up with. My point being is, I would not start up with, my opinion, I would not start with a title. I would start with a design of what outcomes we want. What's the outcome you want to have happen? And by the way, I'm talking about a company that wants to essentially build a pipeline internally, but you could easily do an acquisition pipeline saying, well, we don't have the culture or the speed to build that internally because we've beaten innovation out of our core. We don't have those people all quit. But you can decide, well, we have enough stock or cash to do M&A. Okay, let's figure out how we're acquiring, or let's figure out some JVs, or let's figure out something else. Just remembering that unless we're going to acquire something of size and scale, we're going to be acquiring MVPs and we're going to be experimenting. Does that help at all? Right. There is no one size fits all, but we need a different, I think we need a different model than the one we have today. And the symptoms are all around us. I think in the United States, the last thing I think I saw from Deloitte is in the 20th century, the average life cycle or lifetime of a public company was, I don't know, 35 or 40 years. And in the 21st century, it's about 15. That's another symptom that we've not gotten stupider, that the world has gotten tougher, but our organizational design kind of remained the same. And if you think about it, org charts were not found chiseled into the pyramids. They're kind of a modern construction starting about, at least in the US, about the 1850s or 1860s, when we developed a functional organization. We had sales and manufacturing and engineering. And that was the type of organization we had till about the 1920s, until DuPont and GM created divisionalization. And so now we created another type of organizational structure. You had functional organizations, or you could divisionalize. And then in the 1950s and 60s in the US, out of the aerospace industry, they kind of created matrix organizations. You had functional groups, but you pulled teams out of them and basically had, intermediate groups that worked on specific projects, new aircraft designs. And then when those designs were finished or those projects shipped, they went back to the functional units. But that's about it. Those are the three types of organizational designs. Maybe there's some others I've missed. I think we're going to need to create a new model here, which again will be driven by some doctrine. So I've been babbling, Cristobal. I don't know if those are answering it.
No, great, Steve. We're wrapping up, and I think Tanya asked a question here. There's a couple of questions. So we discussed in this symposium moonshots, and we saw examples of really companies addressing distant bets and deploying them. So Tanya says, my hypothesis of this where that moonshots should happen, and at M&A space, or just internally, or as something that you can nurture from itself. What do you think in terms of moonshooting?
So the answer, Tanya, is yes. And I'm saying that just to make the point. It really depends on your company culture and your stomach for innovation. And it's important to remember, and to get your leadership to remember, or if you're the leadership, is that if you think about what you're trying to do inside of a large company, if you're trying to do it from internally, is look at not startups, but look at venture capitalists. They have a portfolio of bets. It's a big idea. It's the canonical, for every 10 they fund, 6 will fail and 3 kind of are okay, and it's 1 or 2 that make the fund. And by the way, to get to those 10 they fund, they kiss a lot of frogs to find the prince, which means, they're talking to hundreds of companies. And so think of this again as a funnel, right? Look at hundreds of opportunities, give money to 10, expect failure in most. Well, if that's what you're prepared to do internally, set up a moonshot division. right? Because now you say, oh, I just don't want to have that funnel for Horizon 1 and 2 stuff. A moonshot basically says, I want to have Horizon 3 things only in my internal organization. So make sure your company has the bandwidth to look at a lot of things and has big enough to have a lot of those things, has the financial and political and cultural stamina to kind of isolate them. And by the way, if you're doing moonshots, Horizon 3 activities, we've learned this for 100 years. In no way can they be in the same physical location as the existing organization. They can't be reporting to an existing P&L. They can't be whatever. When we're talking about moonshots, they need to be external. And Tanya, if your company can't do that, then your point is correct, is why don't we just acquire them that have actually have gotten some product market fit or some early evidence. And obviously the price you acquire them for is a lot more expensive than if you build it, but ultimately it might make sense. And so the answer is, this is a strategic conversation that your mileage may vary, meaning it depends on your company. Some companies are better equipped to just deal with M&A. Some companies, are large enough and have enough technical people that it's worth keeping them, and because those people will leave if you don't engage them in high risk projects. And so I'm going to give you the business school answer for sure. The business school answer, it depends.
Thanks.
And I saw another great question, Cristobal. It's my thought about entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial minded individuals. So you got to be careful. As remember, I said a good chunk of them, in hindsight, don't want a innovation organization. They want to do heroics, and it's not bad. It's just that you need to separate out those that are happy being individual heroic contributors, because they are actually great at finding their way through the bureaucracy and figuring out how to get things done. You don't want to demotivate them. But you want to be clear whether any of them actually want to be your partner in changing the organization, or are they just wonderful people that you want in place that make stuff happen. Does that make sense? I mean, it's not that it's not that they can't play a role in innovating in the organizations they work, because they help shape culture. I was just surprised about how many don't want to change the organization itself. And by the way, when we say entrepreneurs, I want to point out something that's true both in large companies and in startups. And let me use startups first, and we'll pass this on to companies. In a startup, there's at least two very different types of people who start a company, and you need both. You need the innovator, somebody who creates the technology or has the insight or something else, but they're useless without the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur maybe can't even use the technology, but they know how to create a reality distortion field to get customers and funding and to figure out how to scale, and they're usually Mr. Outside. What's an example? The classic Apple computer story. Steve Wozniak was the innovator. Steve Jobs couldn't design a piece of hardware if his life depended on it, but he was the entrepreneur. Microsoft. Bill Gates was the entrepreneur. Paul Allen was the innovator. Tesla. Obviously Musk was the entrepreneur, and he likes to call himself chief designer. I don't think he knows one end of the motor from the other. It was J.B. Straubel who designed it. And so we could go on. And they're usually more of a complicated team. But at least those two components are almost always found in separate people. In large companies, the equivalent is you have the innovator, but the entrepreneur in this case is someone who knows how to do those heroics of figuring out who's the person in finance who could get them the budget, or they know, which salesperson won't scream if they just start calling on customers, etc. So their entrepreneurship is usually how to work the system. And those are the skills that you actually don't want to get rid of. You just want to put into a bigger process. So I hope I answered that question. And
Great.
moving from, do we have time to answer the last one?
Yeah, last question.
So moving from profit to purpose be part of the solution for new organizational model. I'm spending a lot of my time with the U.S. government, and You know, when we use the business model canvas, the first thing one of them told me is, Steve, if we had revenue and profit, we'd go to jail. So we designed something. For all you should know, there's something called the mission model canvas that Osterwalder and I came up with, which we use for government organizations and nonprofits. But in doing so, it made us realize that even the military has problems in focusing on outcomes, right? They tend to focus on activities. It's like, well, we wrote this requirements document, we're done. Or we've gone through this acquisition process, we're finished. Rather than, no, what exactly do we want to accomplish? So I actually wrote about this, and 20 years ago in the chapter 6 of the 4 steps to the epiphany, is that having a mission focused, and I don't mean the corporate PR, bullshit, like we're here to make the world a better place. I mean, some very focused departmental, what's our mission? What do we want to do? Remember, I keep going to, what's the purpose of innovation inside of a corporation? My definition, it's to deliver things that matter with speed and urgency. Come up with yours. If you don't have that, if you don't have like a statement of why do we need this stuff, then like you haven't even started with what's the purpose part of why you exist. So Cristobal, this has been fun. You always ask tough but interesting questions.
Great,
I hope,
and you answered
this was...
in a great way.